We are live on this holiday weekend, President's Day in the U.S. and up in Canada. It's in Ontario here. It's Family Day, and other provinces have it as well. So maybe we'll have a few more joining us. So we're live streaming on LinkedIn and YouTube, GFMA YouTube platforms. We have David Baxter. We're fortunate to have him. He's back home for a little while, so we're fortunate to have David Baxter back again. He's got a wealth of knowledge and experience in many areas, the PPP arena being first and foremost. But anyway, happy to have David. He'll give us a quick intro of his background for those that don't know him. And he's returned from Ukraine and also from the PPP event for the week, PPP week in Turkey, in Istanbul. So lots to talk about. And without further ado, David, welcome back.
Thank you.
Tell us about yourself briefly.
A bit about myself. So you've heard from my accent, I'm not from around this part of the world. I'm originally South African. About 30 years ago, I married an American, didn't look at the marriage contract well. And when the day after we got married, when I asked if she was moving to South Africa, she said she didn't know what I was talking about, and hence how I landed up living in the United States. Strange enough, people find this strange, but I'm a geographer by training. I'm not an engineer or a lawyer or anything like that. But geographers are always very interested in spatial development and spatial arrangements, and that's how I got into my field of, let's say, regional or large-scale planning of projects and that. I worked originally in the West, in the Rocky Mountains, on oil and gas, which you call it projects, and then slowly got more and more involved in the international development work, where I worked with the Millennium Challenge Corporation and, unfortunately, the now non-existing USAID, before landing up to work with procurement and public-private partnerships for organizations such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, even with the Islamic Development Bank and UNDP. I mean, I think you name most of the big development organizations, and somehow I've worked in them. I also am one of the leaders of the World Association of PPP Units and Professionals, WAP, and the chair of the North American chapter of WAP, where I got to know Wayne very well. And I was trying to count up how many countries I've worked in, but generally I've worked in about 45 countries, I think, at present.
Amazing.
And most of the work recently has been on public-private partnerships. So even though I am sort of recognized as a public-private partnership expert, I'm also procurement, development, regional development, and with a focus on sustainability, resilience, and achieving sustainable development goals.
Excellent. Yeah, and I was fortunate. I just recently mentioned WAP in the quarterly magazine. I know it's coming up for those listening for more writers or articles for the upcoming quarterly magazine. But we were fortunate that I was fortunate to work with you and co-write the an article relating to the, my background domain, obviously melded with the PPPs venue sector as far as asset operations and the long-term things. So that was good. I mean, just maybe expand on that from your perspective, how the importance of that, how that often gets overlooked. They sort of put these deals together, but then they forget about long after the political capital has been expended or gained at the time, and the photo ops, 2 years later, maybe they're not as successful as they was previously envisioned. Tell us about that.
So when you work with public-private partnerships, there's, the upfront people who do the conceptualizing and the planning of the project. And that usually involves a lot of planners, engineers, etc. Then you go through the procurement process, which is, a big exercise essentially to choose the best partner and to minimize risk. And that tends to be a bit more of a legal aspect, even though you do have to do the technical evaluation of bidders, proposals, etc. And that does require you to have a multidisciplinary team. But the one area that is really neglected, and I've met so many people who say they're PPP professionals, and yes, we are all, but they've always focused on the upfront. And once the contract is signed and the euphoria, as I think you said, Wayne, sort of the ribbon cutting and the photo ops are done, the hard work starts. And in a PPP process, when you're looking at the full life cycle, the planning, the procurement, etc., and the transactional side of securing loans, etc., that usually would be, 1 to 2 years, 3 years, more likely. But then everyone forgets about the next 25 to 27 years of a 30-year PPP project. And that's where it really is focused on, risk management, asset management, which is where Wayne and I have a very common area, because you've got to maintain the asset throughout its lifetime. And hopefully you can maintain it and even do better, that it improves over time. So it addresses things like technological obsolescence and aging of the facility and that. Because what people forget is you're managing risk, but you're managing risk so that the project will succeed, it'll be sustainable, it will be resilient. And then one thing that people forget is that you're eventually going to give that project back to the public sector, because public-private partnerships, and I always stress this, is not privatization. It's sharing of responsibilities between the public and private partner for X amount of years, with the intention most times of the asset reverting back to the government proponent. Even governments forget that, because they see you're euphoric and excited about getting the project moving. And then when you come and ask them about, okay, so what's your plan for the handover, take back, and that, they look at you dumbstruck and say, oh, we didn't.
Blank look, like, what do you mean? Yeah, that's a very good point. And like I said, I know you've been involved. A lot of what you do is guidance and advisor on different projects, of course, but also what seems to be a much needed space is capacity building on the government side. Like you mean, it's great. That's the whole one of the premise of the PPP to begin with. Is there's the risk transfer and financial aspect of it, of course, but there's also the expertise, which typically the public sector did not have, or not having anywhere near enough capacity to facilitate doing that type of project. So they reach out to the private sector for their expertise, and then like you said, there's the they don't have, and sometimes they didn't have the money, but I think that PPP's got a bit of a bad name going back a few years, because they there was issues with let's say 5-10 years down the road, and then they reflect and say, oh well, then they try to suggest that the PPP model is flawed. But it's really been, number one, a poor agreement and poor governance, or a combination of the two. They didn't really, it wasn't really, had you executed it the way you should have done, and obviously there's a lot of lessons learned. So today, moving forward, we're in a better place, and then we've got technology support and tools to oversee that as well. But I think a lot of it is the making sure you have the right people and with the right tools, and like that strict governance, which governance seems to be more in the forefront than it was before. Like you said, it was sort of they put the deal together, it's technically feasible, but if you don't sort of maintain that sort of that due diligence and sort of oversight and make sure it's as suggested, or build in certain parameters, like you said, for the technology to adopt, because things do change, have a certain buffer built in, then you run into problems in the not too distant future. And it like you said, it gives PPPs a bad name. But tell us about capacity building, because a lot of that is your expertise on all fronts, and you've written the book, so to speak, and your background too in these organizations and best practice and that. So from a PPP perspective, there's very few people in the world that would know better than you, by virtue of your knowledge and experience, to say, here's kind of the guidance, here's what you need, or a roadmap, or what you should do. What do you sort of tell us about your capacity building initiatives, which I know are significant?
So I think, Wayne, you spot on in that regard. It's always the interesting things, the planning, the the financing, the glamorous stuff, the running of the project. But I used some words early on when I talked about sustainability and resilience. And these projects are only going to be sustainable and resilient if you have sustainable and resilient institutions behind them. And so often, governments think, well, we can just hand the project off to the private sector and not worry about it for the next 30 years. They'll manage it and that. But, one thing that has to take place is also the monitoring, evaluation of activities and that. And unless your team is trained in that area and has the capacity to do the monitoring and the evaluation of the private sector partner, you are going to just increase the risk opportunity tremendously. So it's not a sign and walk away and forget, and then 30 years later, somebody knocks on your door and said, project's finished, and here it is. You have to engage a team that is going to be actively involved throughout the process, almost like a shadow government, if you want to call it that is going to ensure that the private sector does a lot. Now, the one thing that is always important, that typically if you are choosing a very competent partner, if you're in the public sector, you are going to choose institutions that have done these projects before in other countries and have the knowledge and the expertise. But most government institutions will only do that once or twice. They don't do lots and lots and lots of PPP projects. And so the institutional knowledge on how to do the, to how monitor the projects to ensure the enabling environment is strong enough that people know what the legal constraints are, the practical constraints, etc. It does require quite a lot of capacity building or institutional capacity building, and for both sides. So often I have, done capacity building with governments around the world to help the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury, usually, which is the central organization with a PPP unit, to help different line ministries and agencies develop or deliver PPP projects, but they don't often have the knowledge. The same is also with the private sector. If it's a new area or a new country where PPPs are being done, you also have to do a lot of capacity building with the private sector, because they think they understand the project and they think they understand the commitments, but often there's, an underestimation of the effort and underestimation of the skill sets that are needed. And one of the things that I really focus on is also team building and, communication, etc. Because
Absolutely.
if you put an engineer and a lawyer and a planner and a sociologist and whatever all into the room,
It's quite a mix.
they need to speak a common language and have a common approach on that. And that's where the capacity building really becomes important.
Yeah, I was going to say that seems to be an integral point. You're at the vantage point of being able to sort of know the process, know all the stakeholders, and know what's required, but not be sort of sitting in a certain discipline where you're going to be very well honed in that particular skill or discipline, but not looking at the bigger picture. So you're able to sort of look at that and, like you say, look at the technical and legal aspects and how that all ties together, what you need. And you really need someone like yourself or people that you're giving guidance to in particular key positions, both on the public and the private side, to say, here's what you need to sort of steer this in the right direction and keep it that way. So that's a good point.
I'd also add that often stakeholders are forgotten as well. We don't build projects just because we can. We build projects because people need them. And so you need to involve the communities that are involved. And, they really also do under NGOs and civil organizations, and that also really need to understand that what PPPs are about, that it's not free stuff, that you're not, that it's not privatization, which is critically important, because as soon as you say PPPs, people think there's going to be privatization involved, which it's not the case. So it's a capacity building of the many, many different stakeholders.
There seems like to be an awful need, just based on many facts of aging infrastructure and that sort of thing. You don't have to look too far and wide to see that, there's huge demand, more than that whatever you could deliver, which is not the case. Obviously, they can't get enough together. I mean, finding the money and there's certainly the need to do it, I guess. Is that they've also narrowed it down to smaller projects. So PPPs were always associated with big infrastructure, like some of the ones I've been fortunate to work on, like Calgary Green Line for LRTs and major things, which take a long time or are very expensive, these multi-year, multi-billion-dollar projects. But also the smaller aspects, which are much needed. Like it could be something like in the water or something on a much smaller scale. And also in the US, that would be, wouldn't be like a federal thing. It'd be on a municipal state level, maybe even municipal, where you have that seems to be more of a trend in the last couple of years, this sort of small is beautiful, small PPPs, that sort of thing, which is a good way to go.
And it is a relative term, because a small PPP project of, say, $200 million in the United States or Canada would be an enormous project in an emerging community.
Sure.
But I think what's happening, we talk about the infrastructure gap. We talk about, the world's population having more and more resource needs and that. But what's also happening and becoming interesting is when you look at the demographic trends of many countries, their populations are decreasing. And so I think over time, the need for very large scale PPP projects, once they've been built, is going to move to another phase of maintaining them. But as you said, newer projects are going to be more locally focused, local governments, local institutions and that, and are going to be the simpler things like a water supply system to city, a garbage removal system, and ones which are scalable because of, what's happening to demographics and populations and that. And so there is, under WAP and other organizations, there's an increased focus on small scale PPPs, or some people just like calling them municipal level PPPs,
Sure.
where you are focusing again on people's needs, specifically engaging a lot more with the local communities because it's a project of scale to their community. And then also focusing, I think, on, for example, a great focus on the sustainable development goals of that area. Many countries say, oh, we've committed to X amount of sustainable development goals, and we can't do that in all projects. And I agree, because every project is unique. So when you're doing a small scale project, you need to look at the specific needs of that project, and don't set yourself unrealistic goals to solve the world's problems. You need to focus on solving the problem of that community.
Yeah, excellent point. Just stepping back to when you gave us your background, I laughed. I wanted to remember to mention when you said your major was geography, and that was kind of like your thing, which is obviously completely different from what you're engaged in now. But it is somewhat ironic that because of your sort of extreme travel as being a world traveler, because of how much you travel, and it's amazing that you're able to do that, and you do that. How much that sort of supported you in your, knowing your way around the globe. But speaking of global as a perspective, what is it? Where do you see the sort of the growth trends, maybe in the next 3 to 5 years? You mentioned the U.S. Obviously, there's a need there with certain things. Depends on the governments of the day and what funding or what's in the private sector, public. But also, like in Asia and other places you travel to, there's probably more of a need there. I would imagine some parts of the world. Where do you see the sort of the most focus or trends?
So at the Istanbul conference 2 weeks ago, the title was Humanizing, PPPs. And so the element there was very much focused on, again, building infrastructure that has impact and that has meaning. The things that people were talking about is, water supply, power generation and electricity supply to homes.
Right.
That was important. But there was one topic that surfaced and caused quite a lot of conversation also, was the focus on transnational projects. And because, contrary to what a lot of people believe and say, the world is globalizing and will continue to globalize, it's not going to, I don't see this shrinkage maybe that you're even seeing in the United States with the current administration, where they're saying, oh, we don't need the rest of the world. Eventually, we're going to need the rest of the world.
Absolutely.
The result of that is, how do we build infrastructure that not only just helps a country, but helps a group of countries? And the discussion there was heavily focused on landlocked countries. So if you look at maps, not a lot of them, but in South America, there's some landlocked countries. In Africa, there's definitely a lot.
Africa would be probably a good, yeah.
And Central Asia, there are a lot of landlocked countries. And these countries' economic growth, unfortunately, in many ways, is almost held hostage by their neighbors who have access to the sea, because they only focus really on their own trade, for example. So these transnational projects are critically important. And Wayne, we've had this discussion with the North American chapter as well. If you just look at Canada and Mexico and the United States, how interactive our how would you call it, or interlinked our infrastructure.
It's definitely intertwined. Well, we did the Colorado River, that maybe, which Oscar, our esteemed colleague, brought that up, and there was a good history on that, and that has evolved over the years. But there's certainly the need to address that issue is not diminished. If anything, it's increased. Because of needs of that.
I think that's increasingly important. For example, just like the latest week's controversy, what's it, the Gordie Howe Bridge or whatever they call it, the bridge between Canada and the United States, where, it's essential for the car industry, automobile industry, trade and all of that, and movements. And, the threats to shut it down and not allow it to open and all of that, which does have ramifications for different countries. So when you look at this transnational project, you also got to find common points of interest and common benefits, and that was a discussion as well. Hi there, Wayne.
Okay, well, technology is great when it works, as I always say, but that was a long lapse. And connectivity. Hope our viewers, yeah, very strange. But anyway, okay. Well, Kathleen just said Wayne disappeared. Talk to us, David. So you rejoined before I did. So anyway, I'll go to just to lose our train of thought. Finish. Just do you remember what you were saying? I mean,
I was just saying, the importance of the transnational projects.
oh yeah, right.
For example, like the connectivity between Canada and the United States, the bridge that was
Absolutely
threatened to be shut down. That if we're going to do transnational projects, we need to be aware of political challenges.
true.
And also have a common identity, because when you spend billions on infrastructure, you can't just have it cancelled at the whim of somebody. There's also financial considerations, political risk, geographical. You go down the list.
Yeah, that's true enough. Yeah, no, good point. All very good points. And yeah, and like you said, these projects, they're like 30-year projects, PPPs. Governments don't usually stick around that long. Some do, but very few, and certainly not in the Western world. It's like after, you get 8 years if you're lucky, or not so lucky, depends how you look at it. And in Canada, the same. You get a several years of a similar government, but once it's some. No, absolutely. There's this to be looked at. We have a question. I'll just, one of our partner raised a question about Fran. He said, for finances and risk management, how are they shared in a PPP? Is everything 50-50, or what are the typical ratios? I know that can vary. You'd be the subject matter expert, of course, to answer that, but it can really vary how you sort of split the arrangements, and it's consortium with a long-term or a commission,
Yeah, I think it all depends on the time. It depends on the type of the project and the amount of gap funding or financing that is needed. And many times governments have equity in the project, and to lower the cost of the financing, that can be good in some aspects, but in other aspects it can also be bad, because it then results in the government thinking that because it's a shareholder and an equity shareholder, and it's sharing the risk of the financing, that it should have more say than it should. And that's
True.
not the case, because every PPP project, for those who are novices to this, you create what they call a special purpose vehicle, or a project company, that is a legal entity that is not bound to anyone. And so, I often have this question of, when a government is a partner in a SPV, should it be a 50-50? Should it be a, 51-49 or whatever? And I always say as minimal as possible.
I was just going to say less is better.
Yeah.
Less is more as far as the whole overall objective.
The project's going to be run as a business and not as a government public works situation. And that requires a different mindset and a commitment. And so that would result, in the cut and all of that. If there's going to be a primary investor, if there's going to be what they call mezzanine financing, where you have, different groups offering different amounts. There's the other term that's becoming also more popular, is blended finance. So I don't believe there's just one specific answer to it, but it really needs to be customized or tailorized, or whatever the term is, to the specific needs of the project. And obviously, the more financing that is needed, there's going to be usually more investors, because no one wants to have a $1 billion loan on their tab, but they might be willing to have.
Speaking of that, we have a question. Kathleen brought a question up. She's our colleague that we've going to be doing some upcoming on major projects, data centers, that sort of thing, which is another thing which is on the forefront. But risk is a thing. Obviously, risk is key. That's one of the top, other than the finance part of it, the risk is the key element, no matter how you look at it or how you transfer to who's bearing what risk. Is that improved over time with lessons learned and the sort of better governance and technology? Because that's always a factor. You've always got risk, but is it getting better as far as adroitly dealing with that, or not? Or is that still always, because years ago it was.
Yep. I think that risk is going to
do that well over time. The risk could have been mitigated, but it wasn't. So,
Yeah, I think risk mitigation has improved because people become more aware of the type of risks. But, just to introduce a new aspect is the whole idea of, artificial intelligence. And this is a role where I think it can play a very prominent role, because it can almost sort of ensure that there's continuous automated monitoring of risk. And it takes, to a certain degree, which I don't always agree fully should happen, the human error factor out, makes it a sort of an algorithm process where it is constantly, repeatedly checking. And that helps. So, I think, when it comes to risk, over the last 30, 40 years of PPPs, there are an enormous amount of lessons have been learned about risk. But I think as people become more and more aware of risk, they become more cautious about risk.
Sure.
And we have to make sure we don't get paralyzed by over-analysis of risk, but that we also use the tools that are available to improve monitoring. And so, really, to answer your question, risk will always be there. The risks are going to become maybe more sophisticated as
it's getting better, managed better with technology and other process improvements. Excellent. Yeah. Well, speaking of risk, it's good to see you sitting comfortably and safely back home after your recent travels. I was somewhat horrified when you said you were going to Ukraine, given all what's going on in the news. And I appreciate, it depends on certain areas. You're safer in some more than others, but you were pretty much, maybe you can tell us better than I saw the pictures and some of the things. You tell us about number one, the mandate is just enormous that you did that. You and others met in Ukraine, and what you're doing as far as we hopefully in the not too distant future, we can look at rebuilding it as opposed to, the current status quo. But certainly, your travels and tell us all about your Ukraine trip.
So I think what's evolving. There's a coalition of nations and a coalition of willing partners who want to help Ukraine recover. A few years ago, working with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, we developed PPP guidelines for PPPs and recovery in post-conflict countries. Now, Ukraine at the moment isn't post-conflict, but it definitely will be, if all things go right, it'll be heading towards a post-conflict nation. And the project that I'm involved with the World Bank is preparing, I think, for that time when we can start looking at the investment in critical infrastructure, which is most important. And I think you could understand what that would be when it comes to, hospitals, power plants, bridges, roads, the infrastructure that has been really damaged. The focus obviously also is, to have a strategic list of projects, because there must be hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of potential projects of infrastructure that have been damaged. But you're going to have to, one of the aims is to create a pipeline and to work, very closely on prioritizing the projects. And then also, which is going to be a difficult task because of the enthusiasm of people trying to help, is to coordinate the efforts and leverage them and not duplicate. Because there's a lot of institutions, the different, the development banks, donors, etc. But it would be, I don't know, foolhardy in a way, I suppose, if I can use that term, that if you don't coordinate those efforts, develop a national pipeline, develop a process. And so the public-private partnership agency is going to be leading the initiative with support of the different banks. And I'm supporting what they call the PPF, which is the the project preparation facility, which is being supported by the World Bank, to look at projects, not just, and I must stress that, not just PPPs, but all sorts of projects, traditional procurements as well as PPPs. I think the role where PPPs will play an increasing role is because there's going to be an enormous funding gap for infrastructure development. And so there are going to be projects that need to be done with the support of the private sector.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would think you're sort of being cautiously optimistic. I would say that as we're going into year 5 of this unfortunate war. But assuming that, now is probably a better time to sort of think realistically about getting ahead of that, preparing, like you said, in the pipeline, depending what they have for funds that they have for maybe some of the assets that were frozen, and they can really utilize those. But it seems like there's enough support as far as getting the financing and the wherewithal, and certainly enough companies that would do that. It's just like you said, structuring, organizing, and prioritizing. It's a huge initiative, but that would be wonderful to see that sort of start to take place over. I appreciate it. It's a very and aggressive timeline, but
Yeah, and another thing which you touched on early on is the institutional capacity, capacity building, because there's going to be nation building on a scale that hasn't happened in Ukraine ever, maybe, and so
Yeah.
there are hundreds, if not, I don't know how many ministries, agencies, local government institutions, and that are all going to be looking at, how do we do this? But we've got to help with the capacity building. And that's one of the focuses of these initiatives with the agency, the PPF, et cetera, and that.
Right. One thing I didn't want to, again, I just touch on it briefly because it's there, but it's not the sort of thing you have to deal with, focus on, but it's corruption. I mean, in certain countries and in parts of the world, it's more prevalent than others. And that seems to be getting rooted out. And with AI and all the other technologies and better governance and sort of the absolute determination and diligence to ensure, good money isn't thrown after bad, is that does not happen. Do you see that sort of being mitigated? I mean, certainly I don't isolate Ukraine as an example. I just mean, it's come up everywhere. So it's something you have to be part of the equation to say, yeah, we're aware of what the potential risk in that element too, because that's lost money and that doesn't contribute in a positive way, obviously, to the project. So how do you see that as being sort of mitigated or dealt with?
It is a challenge. It's a major challenge. And I can't remember what minister it was, but just yesterday or the day before, a Ukrainian minister was arrested at, I believe, in the Polish, what you call Ukrainian border, trying to flee the country because he was under investigation for corruption. Unfortunately, there was, a lot of that, but the program that I'm working with on the World Bank and the donors and that, there's definitely a focus on governance and monitoring, etc., and just trying to break that, I think when you call it a tradition or a culture of corruption.
I mean, some companies are famous for this, and thereby they've actually shot themselves in the foot because they're so lax that they're on the list of the no-go places for these projects. So it's unfortunate, but hopefully that gets.
Interesting. I was speaking to a very high up person in the Rotary organization yesterday, and he is mobilizing, volunteers through Rotary, which is a big, everyone knows who Rotary is.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's made numerous trips to Ukraine, and I said, is it necessary to make trips to Ukraine so much? And he says, yes, because every time we give something to local governments and that, we go there personally and do the handover to the community that it was intended for, to make sure that it doesn't get sold and the money goes to some unscrupulous official and the people who are meant to be helped don't get it. So, I think as long as that happens, it's going to be more and more difficult for corruption. But it's not unique to Ukraine, but it is a consideration that is receiving considerable amounts of attention. And none of the donors, lenders, what you call it, any of those organizations are going to allow it to happen on their watch, on their projects.
Yeah. No, it's good. That's good that the money goes in the right places. What else about Ukraine? I mean, certainly you travel. I mean, whatever you want to share as far as your experience. But like I said, kudos to you for actually getting there. And it's something you'd read like in a novel that maybe you'll write a book about that and that'll be a chapter. But it was rather interesting, and sort of just listening to your almost play by play. We're almost at the Polish border. They go, oh God, get across there, David. Yeah. We're all rooting for you. But there's a certain. I mean, it wasn't certainly just something. It wasn't far from a walk. Maybe more than you thought when you went over there. You thought you were actually guided and fairly safe to a point, but there's always that risk element too. You could just be, when the train stops and the lights go off and they say, we're going to sit here for a few minutes, that's not a routine. I'm just taking a train across Europe sort of moment,
People ask me, what was it like there? And, I'm going to say something, it sounds totally strange, but it's the only way I can describe it. It was normal if it wasn't for the air raids and the bombs.
So, beautiful pictures. Yeah, you sent me some great pictures.
People are on the streets doing their thing. There's traffic jams. The businesses are busy. The restaurants are, full. The supermarkets have everything they need. So if you didn't have like 3 or 4 air raid warnings every day, you would think, where's the war? Now, I got to say, I was in Kyiv, which is not anywhere near the Donbas region, and that's a different story.
True.
But one thing that I do want to say about the Ukrainian people, everyone's saying, oh, maybe they just should sue for peace and give up and all that.
No.
They are very resolute, and there's no ways that they are beaten. I didn't meet one Ukrainian who said, yeah, we would trade peace for anything.
No.
That's
Churchill
not.
said that a long time ago. He said, a country that gives up basically is finished, but one that sort of is defeated but rises up will come back another day. And you're right. There's no surrender. There's just absolutely, it's not even an option.
And the inconvenience, I think, was minimal. One day we didn't have water because the left side of the city had been bombed, and they targeted the power facilities.
Right.
Which the power went down and meant the water pumping stations to the city stopped operating for 2-3 hours. But, I read an article and I spoke to some Ukrainian governments, and they have become the world leaders, literally, in recovery of critical infrastructure. You can just imagine in the West, United States, if somebody bombed the main national railway line, it'll be 2-3 weeks before they can, get it up and running. Ukraine doesn't have that luxury. So they literally will rebuild within 3 to 4 hours. So
they're the resiliency experts, which our dear colleague David Dodd would probably agree with us that,
And I think there's a big career future for many people in Ukraine who've worked under those circumstances, if they were ever to help other countries with disaster recovery on that, because they have got it fine-tuned. And there was only one scary incident I had. And, if you go to Ukraine these days, you can't fly in. You've got to go by train.
No, you go by train,
from Warsaw to
sure.
Kyiv. And I suppose there were two things that were interesting. So when I arrived in Kyiv after 17.5 hours in a train that was filled with people, pitch dark inside and superheated, they only have 2 heats there, no heat or ultra hot heat.
Too hot, you're sweating.
And as I got to Kyiv, the air raid sirens went off, but I was very well looked after. And there was a minder who literally was waiting for me. And I stepped out the carriage and he said, "Hi, David," because he'd seen my picture before, and grabbed me in my arm, and off we went under tunnels and all sorts of things. And he took me to my hotel. And then he said to me the next morning, which I felt honored, he said, "I knew you were going to be all right, because you didn't say to me, put me on the next train back to Warsaw, because it's not fun to arrive in a air raid." So that was the one. So that was a bit of setting the how would you call it, the context of it.
The tone of,
The worst part, well, there were 2 things that happened. And one is it was very sad. On the Sunday, I went to the big central square, the Maidan.
Saw those pictures.
And I was walking around, and there are thousands and thousands, literally, of people, of young men, fathers, uncles, brothers, cousins, however, they're all photos of dead people. And it hit me hard. I had to go back to my hotel and have a bit of a pity party, because I just realized that, this is not the news. This is the reality.
No, and you don't see that every day on the news. You see all the devastation, which is in stark contrast to some of the nice pictures you said. You said, well, you'd never know there was a war going on, but I did see those pictures you sent of the square and those people, and it's just the resilience, and not only resilience of what they're doing to do what they have to do, but of the people themselves. It's a testament to, they've been through a lot, and it's heartbreaking, for sure.
And the other sobering point was when I was returning to Warsaw, right in the middle of the night, the train literally screeched to halt. All the lights went out, and we completely stopped. It wasn't, stop, go, stop, go. It was just stop. And I thought,
how long was that for, David? How long was that?
Maybe an hour or whatever.
Oh, really?
But
I'm sure that seemed like an awful long hour. You couldn't wait to get out of there, but.
And no one was panicking on the train. That's the thing, is
really?
Ukrainians are very stoic, and they one person said to me, "We got to live life to the full, because you don't know if you're going to be dead."
Well, that's true. That's true. How far away were you from the border, from getting into this?
We were close to Kyiv. And then when I got to Warsaw and opened, looked at my thing, realized that a train that had left Kyiv station behind us was bombed, a civilian train, and people were killed. So, I used, I said, my experience to people in Kyiv is, it's Russian roulette of a new intention. It's not with a revolver with one bullet. It's if you get hit by a missile,
drone or a missile on a civilian area or population, it's just unbelievable. I don't think your wife will let you go back there anytime soon, until things have settled substantially after the war, and even then, just sort of, it's a much safer place to go.
she's given me her blessing that I can go back, but
Yeah.
I'll be less naive, and I'll be a lot more conscious of what I'm going into, because I didn't have a clue what I was going into.
Yeah, no, well, that's amazing. And you were there just shy of a week. I mean, the travel time, but a week. Yeah. Wow. Well, there's nothing like being there and experiencing that, of course, and then the meetings you had, which are vital. I mean, you just can't. It's not the same as being on a Zoom call or whatever. It's being there in person and seeing firsthand and meeting the people. So, but it's amazing. Just you were well guided. Like, it wasn't just something you did, willy nilly to sort of, hey, I'll just jump on a plane and go over there. It was well coordinated, which obviously for your safety had to be. But it sounds like they have a real good organizational structure. Obviously just to function, survive, and do whatever. But obviously they're thinking ahead of rebuilding in Ukraine, which hopefully is not that too far before that long-term process can start. So that's great that you were tasked or asked to do that. And how many of there were you in your sort of your working group? I think there was.
There's different groups. I would say it's about 10 to 15 people that are working on this strategy. But I went as the PPP expert. There were people who are experts on, other elements and that. But I think, just to look at what they're planning in that is, we always talk about sustainability, resilience, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and that. I think these projects are going to have a very, very high focus on that in comparison to other projects, because of the limited resources and the enormous amount of reconstruction that has to take place. Everything they build has got to be built to last, because there's not going to be 5 years' time we can fix it if it's not working, because there's still going to be an enormous backlog. And so I think we are going to see some really ultra good quality projects coming out of Ukraine.
It'll be a model. I mean, to sort of be for other locations, maybe the Middle East, where you hope that things in the Gaza Strip and other places war gets settled, that they have to. There's so much rebuilding. I mean, it's just rubble. When you look at the pictures, there's nothing there. So it's like,
And maybe that's a lesson that we need to learn to do more with less. Because so many. I mean, just if you think of like some of the New York City subway projects, where 3 or 4 miles of subway costs $4 or $5 billion. I mean.
I won't even touch on the local one here in Toronto that just went way over, which I will say I was involved on the front end, but not through it. And after the fact, it's just, how do these things go delayed so long? You go over budget. It's just.
You think in an emerging economy, or $1 billion or $5 billion, it could like reform the whole power system of a country.
You could do a lot with that money.
Rebuild all the schools or something like that. So I think we have to look at that as well. And please don't, misunderstand me. We've got to find a way to streamline the bureaucracy. I mean, and I think this is going to be an issue in Ukraine. Is yes, we need to do feasibility studies, we need to do environmental impact statements and that, but we don't need feasibility studies that take 5 years, and we don't.
Well, the over-analysis paralysis. Yeah, you fall into that. And it just that serves nobody. And as time goes on, the costs go up, and who knows? Yeah, you've got to be. Yeah, I agree.
And there's a global body of knowledge. If you build a railway line, what environmental risks they can be. If you build a power plant, you can have a checklist, look at it, address it, and come up with mitigations. But you don't have to spend 5 years doing that.
And tell us about. I'm just cognizant of time, but we're doing well. I mean, we're always here to answer questions of those that post, but certainly going to Turkey. That's not a new thing, because you've been doing that for what is it, the 10th year? This is their 10th year anniversary, and you're the co-chair, and you've been very much involved in an integral way. So tell us about the PPP week in Istanbul. That was quite a success, and humanizing. That's a great. I mean, certainly that resonates with everybody, and that's certainly an aspect you don't want to forget about.
So Dr. Eyüp Aydın of the PPP Center of Excellence in Istanbul and I started this process 10 years ago. And what I think the thing that was most amazing is how PPPs have changed over 10 years. 10 years ago, it was just big projects, mega projects, bragging projects, prestige projects, all those sort of things. And then over time, countries, especially in emerging economies, got more and more involved in the conference. And it's almost interesting now that there are more emerging economies participating in the conference than the 5 or 6 Western countries that dominate the debate. And so what has happened is the conference is a wonderful neutral forum, because there were people from 30 plus countries, who were there, who would never ever get the chance to talk to one another about their challenges, their opportunities, lessons learned, and all of that.
Sure.
That was one advantage. The Turkey is also an incredible place to have the conference, because I think they have the highest number of PPP projects in the world, and they have built everything from incredible mega infrastructure like the Bosphorus tunnel, the major bridges over it. If you think of the new airport that they've built, but also they've gone down to regional areas, where they've built a fantastic system of hospitals in the different provinces, so using PPP. So it's not just everything centered on Ankara or Istanbul, it's global, or not global, but nationwide within that country. And, it's just, again, they have such an advantage over other countries now, because they have so many PPP projects on the go, that they have so much institutional knowledge and capacity that they've developed. And this was also, one of the real valuable efforts or outcomes, let's call it, of the conference, that these people from countries in Africa and Asia, or South America, which are exploring projects, could hear firsthand experiences from, big companies in Istanbul, in Turkey, for example, that have now done 5, 6, 7 major projects, and were very willing to share their lessons learned, risks, risk management, etc. And I think one of the things that I walked away with, what was interesting, is so many of the big infrastructure projects in Turkey finish ahead of schedule, the construction, because they've learned how to use the latest technology, how to streamline the processes, not get excessively bogged down in bureaucracy, etc. And that really, and you could see that with the participants, that Turkish government officials and private sector representatives know one another, they trust one another, they're friendly with one another, they engage. It's not the client, I call it client-slave relationship that often governments look like. These are parties that have learned to work with one another and have a common interest and want to succeed.
Yeah, no, a good point. It's like you said, it's all building it into, in all fairness, to back up to when I alluded to the project here in Toronto, there was COVID, which was part in the middle of that. So, but there again, things happen. So it's obviously, if you dig your heels in and you're not going to be able to work together, then it's not going to be helpful. So irrespective of how good the agreement is, but it's working together. I agree.
And I would say I forgot to mention that I think COVID changed how the world does PPP projects. The whole thing of force majeure management, how do you manage projects that get into a crisis, which is no one's fault, etc. And that I think is where, the debate has been leaning now towards the humanizing aspect, of we're doing projects for people, we're doing projects to make quality, to improve quality of life.
First PPPs and things of that nature. And there was even, that's not a new theme. They were before, they just do these projects and saying, the social infrastructure or whatever is much needed, they get the funding. Like you said, there was the political sort of benefits of that, and it had to be done. So, it would get done, but there wasn't much consideration, to sort of how that's implemented or the impact, even in the construction, much less, after the fact, how it impacts, end users or businesses or whatever. But then there was this thing added into that a few years ago called community benefits or something of that. So it had to be part of it. It was almost like an afterthought, but it was like I won't say a bolt-on sort of thing, but it was kind of like, oh, don't forget about this, but it wasn't integral. Whereas now it's much more intertwined to, is it viable? It's only viable if it serves the people well, today and tomorrow, and how you go about implementing that. So it becomes integral to the process and how you're doing it, which is fundamentally different than just sort of thinking of a few things where there's some benefits, after the fact, which there always is. So it's more than just the optics. But
and I think prioritizing projects, because even in the past under social projects, people would say, for example, sports stadiums and rec centers and that, and a country that needs a hospital, how many libraries or sports centers you need if you haven't got healthcare facilities. So I think the definition of what a social relevant project is is also changing.
Yeah, no, good points. I mean, what's next in this year now, as far as events or things that we have, other than the usual annual things or whatever, as far as the special events for PPPs? Is there anything that's sort of we've got on the radar that you've got on your radar just to share with our audience, or that you can tell us?
A big thing to look out for will be the Barcelona meeting that takes place at the United Nations.
Yep.
They have the annual meeting. It's being done in collaboration with IESA the last week of April. So
Right.
IESA is the business school at the University of Barcelona, which I hope I didn't mess that up. And for example, I've been leading a team that has been looking at off-grid power guidelines, standards, and practices. So we're going to be presenting that there. But also, you know, the artificial intelligence aspect is becoming more important. I'm also going to be taking part in a Saudi Arabia big conference that's taking place. I've been working with the municipality of Riyadh, trying to see how we can do a collaborative event between WAP and the municipality. And I did get good news today, which I will share with the greater body of WAP tomorrow, is that looks like that's moving forward. And then, you know, just, you know, one of the projects that I've been working on, and this is a project that has taken up a chunk of my life, 9 years of it, but that has been trying to establish the enabling environment and best practices in Sri Lanka. And, you know, within the next 2-3 months, they will be close to now signing, after 9 years, the PPP law, and really establishing the National Agency for Public-Private Partnerships on that. So, you know, those are some of the milestones that I see, and this is being duplicated or replicated all over the world, you know. And I think what's happening also now with a lot of conferences is they're becoming very much focused on achieving solutions and coming up with new best practices. Yeah, instead of them just being a gathering of people desperately trying to talk about how good they are and that they can do it.
Yeah, it's more focused on objectives or certain themes or projects or priorities of certain types of a project. I mean, data centers, I consider, whether that's a whole, maybe we'll schedule another time for that. But I know you're involved with us on our working group on that with Kathleen and other folks. Yeah. That is just it sounds there's a need for it. I don't think that's going to go away with artificial intelligence, but it's how you facilitate that, and then obviously the energy requirements, and then data centers is how you best go about doing that. It just seems like that's a key thing in itself. But I mean, there's a lot to how that gets put together and the impetus to do that. I mean, the timing too. I mean, how long do you have to wait before that's in place?
Yeah, and I think what's going to be critically important more and more with PPPs is the intellectual property rights of institutions, but also the data rights of ordinary people. You know, how much can organizations know about you without you not knowing that they know it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, true. Yeah, because it's almost like sci-fi becomes reality now from what was before. You just sort of think, yeah, but now it's very real, or what could be, you know, violation of your rights, or, you know, and there's always a security or cybersecurity, that element of it that's not going to go away, that you have to sort of always be to deal with and be cognizant of. Yeah, we've got 4 minutes coming up in the hour. We've got any more questions? I've got one from Fran. It's just back to our PPP model. On the private side, how does that differ from other models, like the value that the private sector side gets? How does it differ from crowdfunding, 501c, and other business models? Is it the size or scope of government? I guess that's a mixed question. One you can certainly answer, but.
So I just think that, you know, one needs to realize that where the source of the financing comes from, there's going to be expectations from the investor or the debtor. And so, yes, social impact financing is becoming more and more important. Really good, and it's good, but it needs to have realistic expectations on, you know, how much of that you can fit into a project to be willing to do it. Crowdsourcing also, you know, what is the pitch that you're going to make that's going to get parties interested in putting money in the project? And I think what we haven't really explored much is, you know, with crowdfunding, is how do you stay true to what the project was about? And how do people who have done crowdfunding actually feel that they want to invest in a future project, or where they ripped off or whatever. So I think the ethical values of these are going to become more and more important.
That's a very good point. And it touches on, I mean, we're involved, and I am certainly on the FM side and with other colleagues for the development of the International Standards Organization for like standards. So for FM, the different standards, and 41001 in particular, which is, the FM focus on process and how to sort of best do that. So that lends itself to, even if you have a vehicle or a venue to do it and get the money and, a target or objective, you still have to go about it. So it still almost comes back to, well, leverage the PPP model, because you need the good governance experience and all that to sort of facilitate doing that anyway. So maybe it's just a different way or more alternative financing, like a crowdfunding. But the point I'm making is, would you see a standard, like a sort of, we talked about this before, we touched on it, like I'm not aware of, and not that I know of every single ISO standard, but or any other, like setting a standard for PPPs. I mean, we certainly have enough, and people like yourself could be, would be the perfect, subject matter expert to sort of assemble and assimilate all this information, put it together and say, yeah, let's create an international standard, an ISO standard for PPPs, and that sort of, or the objective of PPPs, but in a PPP model. Do you see that, or is there anything on anybody's radar, do you think? Or
I think it'll be interesting to see with the work that the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe is doing, because every one of the different things that they're establishing are standards and guidelines. And maybe, it is time to have that conversation. Does it become sort of, set up with the ISO standards or whatever that it's, and I think the biggest challenge in that regard, though, is voluntary compliance and forced or legally required compliance, because that's going to be a big factor on people's willingness to have standards. So currently all the work that I do with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, we always state that these are voluntary guidelines and that not mandatory.
Which the standards are. Mind you, that said, if you embed those and make those requirements in the specifications of an actual document or an agreement, then it becomes enforceable in the sense that you can just adopt that as a best practice. But you're right, the standards in and of themselves are not, they're no, even on a local level, not compliance, it's just best guidance. They're guidance documents, best practice, but it's how it gets incorporated for that knowledge and experience to further that. Well, we've reached at 4 o'clock. We're up on the hour, 3 o'clock your time, but we've sailed through the hour, and I know we could go for another great period of time. There's so much to talk about, but I don't have any other questions or whatever in the hopper here. And like I said, this will be recorded, so even though it's live stream, it is a holiday, so sometimes you get people joining, sometimes you don't. But we'll have the recording, so certainly have you back again, David. You're always a wonderful guest to have. It's never boring. Always interesting, and always timely topics or whatever we're talking about, and certainly happy to listen to you and share your experience and knowledge and insight. And it's an exciting time, and you look at the good things you can do and where it can go. So we will have you back again, and thank you for joining us on this holiday in your neck of the woods as well. Thanks again, David.
Thank you for the invitation, and chat soon.
Okay, take care. Bye for now.